In the heart of a mansion marked by luxury and arrogance, a scene no one would have dared imagine unfolded. The millionaire's wife, accustomed to commanding and humiliating, knelt on the Persian rug amidst the scandal, while the young maid, previously invisible, stood before everyone with an old diary and documents in hand. The entire room held its breath. Servants peered through the doors. The millionaire wavered between shock and revelation, and the hidden gold gleamed in the background like a silent witness to a forgotten truth. And in that instant, everyone knew that the secret she carried was about to turn the fate of the house upside down. The sound of the crystal shattering on the floor echoed through the room like an omen. The entire mansion fell silent. The wife, until then sovereign, knelt on the Persian rug, not out of devotion but out of despair. Before her, the young blonde maid in a simple yet striking uniform stood erect, firm, with the ancient diary and papers in her hands, illuminated by the golden beam falling from the crystal chandelier. The gold in the safe in the background gleamed timidly, but the true brilliance lay in the approaching revelation. This woman, always treated as invisible, carried a secret capable of turning all history upside down. The silence was dense, charged with expectation, and every eye in the room knew that nothing would ever be the same again. The millionaire, motionless in his leather chair, watched the scene before him in shock. His fallen wife howled with hatred and humiliation, while the maid remained a towering shadow of dignity, her eyes fixed, her breathing calm, as if waiting only for the right time to reveal what she knew. Behind the half-open doors, the servants huddled in silence, witnessing the impossible. The mistress kneeling, the maid elevated, but no one yet knew the whole truth. The diary in her hands held more than memories. It bore the signature that could transform that mansion into a stage for justice and silent revenge. The question suffocated everyone. Who, after all, was the true owner of that house? Before we continue, I want you to stop for a moment and think, if you were in her shoes, humiliated, accused, and surrounded by stares, how would you react? Write your answer in the comments below, because every word can make this story even more powerful. And don't forget, your participation helps this message reach even more people. That day began like so many others inside the mansion, long corridors filled with the echoes of hurried footsteps, expensive perfumes masking the heavy air, the distant clink of dishes being polished in the kitchen. But there was something different hovering in the air, an invisible tension that seemed to announce that nothing would end as before. His wife, accustomed to reigning supreme over everyone, glided through the hall like a poisoned queen, controlling every detail, every gesture, every glance of those who served her. The millionaire, seated in his leather armchair, read reports with his mind far away, trying to hide from himself the feeling that he lived in a gilded prison. In the midst of this scene stood she, the young maid. Blonde, pretty, but hidden beneath the simplicity of her uniform, she carried in her eyes something no one bothered to decipher, an ancient, resilient dignity that, even under the shadow of humiliation, never faded. She walked with firm steps, as if every detail of the routine were more than work. It was silent resistance. And it was precisely this firmness that gradually awakened her wife's pent-up fury. It wasn't enough that she was efficient. It wasn't enough that she was polite. Her mere presence was an affront, an uncomfortable mirror reflecting weaknesses her employer refused to see. The gold, hidden in the basement for decades, was the trigger. A chance discovery that could have been a blessing, but turned into a curse. When the maid discovered that gleam buried beneath old boxes, she believed for a moment that the revelation would bring recognition. Instead, it brought accusations. Her wife, with a burning look of envy and fear, branded her a thief in front of everyone, dragging her dignity to the ground. But there was more than just a shiny piece of metal. There was a secret. The diary the young woman had so carefully guarded, the inherited documents she had never shown to anyone, and a story buried deep in the mansion's own past. What seemed like a simple accusation of theft concealed a much deeper dispute. Who was the true owner of this place after all? That afternoon, when his wife stumbled in her own fury and fell to her knees in front of everyone, the salon became the stage for something bigger than a family scandal. The previously invisible employees witnessed the impossible, the mistress humiliated, the maid lifted up in silence. And the millionaire, torn between loyalty and truth, began to see in the young woman's eyes the answer he had always feared. Because in the end, it wasn't just about gold, nor about accusation. It was about destiny, and the secret that Maid carried was about to rewrite the history of that entire house. The mansion's main hall was transformed into a makeshift courtroom. The wife, standing in the center, was both judge and accuser. The maid, in a simple uniform and with a firm posture, stood before her like a defenseless defendant. The word thief had flowed from her lips like poison and in seconds had contaminated everyone present. The gold, until then a symbol of silent power, gleamed inside the safe like fabricated evidence of a crime that never existed. The scene had an audience. The wife's friends, always ready for a spectacle, watched with knowing glances and muffled laughter, like hyenas surrounding their prey. The millionaire, seated in his armchair, watched in silence. His eyes, though confused, betrayed something his wife couldn't bear. Doubt. Doubt was tantamount to betrayal in her mind, and she needed to extinguish any spark of compassion that might arise in him. "You think you can fool me?" his wife snapped, taking a step forward. "You come into this house with your innocent face, thinking you can take advantage of everyone's trust and steal what's ours. But here, my dear, you're nothing." The final word echoed like a whip, striking the maid not only in the flesh but in her soul. The household staff looked at one another. Some lowered their heads, others whispered cowardly comments that reinforced the accusation. No one dared defend her. The young woman, however, didn't react with tears or despair. Her hands trembled, but her eyes remained upright, steady, staring at her wife as if she saw far beyond the scene. This posture bothered her mistress even more. It wasn't submission, it wasn't fear, it was something no one could name. The strength of someone who knows more than they reveal. The millionaire cleared his throat, trying to interrupt the spectacle, but his wife was quicker. She grabbed the piece of gold and held it up before everyone like a trophy. "Here's the proof!" she shouted. It was found in her hands. Who else could have put this in the basement if not the one who intended to steal it? Her friends nodded, satisfied. The gold reflected the light from the chandelier, but the real shine lay in his wife's fury, which he believed he had vanquished. And yet the air in the room felt too heavy, as if a hidden truth pressed against the walls. The maid took a deep breath. She didn't say a word, but her silence was more eloquent than any scream. A silence that didn't beg, didn't ask for mercy, just waited, as if certain that justice sooner or later would fall upon everyone there. At that moment, looks began to change. The millionaire shook hands, the employees hesitated, and even some of her friends felt an inexplicable chill. Because even accused, humiliated, surrounded by lies, the young woman remained standing, and her posture spoke volumes. "You don't know who I am." The mansion's walls couldn't contain the venom that had been distilled that afternoon. The accusation of theft, so furiously hurled by the wife, wasn't confined to the chandelier-lit living room. Like wildfire, it spread through the hallways, reached the kitchen, the gardens, and within hours was running rampant through the quiet streets of the upscale neighborhood. All it took was a whispered comment from a gardener to the delivery man, who then told the neighborhood security guard, for the story to take flight. In messaging groups, the maid was already being labeled a criminal, a thief disguised as innocent, someone who had planned everything coldly. Inside the house, the weight of humiliation grew. The wife seized every opportunity to reinforce her story, transforming the mansion into a stage and the maid into a character in a cruel farce. She ordered her to clean the same rooms over and over again, only to see her bow down. She demanded that she repeat useless tasks simply to fuel her sense of dominance. But the more she tried to crush her, the more the young woman remained steadfast, as if her strength came from elsewhere, from a deep root that no one could uproot. The millionaire watched in silence, torn between loyalty to his wife and the strange feeling that something was wrong with the narrative. The maid's eyes didn't twitch, even under the scornful looks. She didn't defend herself with screams, didn't beg for mercy. Her heavy silence was both a challenge and a promise. Outside, the gossip took on increasingly darker tones. They no longer spoke only of theft, but also of seduction and manipulation. They said the maid used her beauty hidden by her uniform to get close to the millionaire, that the gold was just part of a larger plan. Each mouth added a lie, each ear further distorted the truth. And the more the story grew, the more the young woman's dignity seemed to be crushed by an invisible mob. In the solitude of the simple room she had been assigned, she opened the brown envelope again. There were the documents, the old diary, and the photograph that connected her story to the house's past. She ran her fingers over the faded signature of her father, an honest miner who had left a forgotten right. Her eyes welled up, not from the pain of the present, but from the memory of an old promise. One day the truth would come out. As the mansion filled with whispers and suspicion, the maid knew the humiliation had not yet reached its peak. Her wife's venom needed to run its course. The weight of injustice needed to crush every piece of her soul so that the future revelation would have the force of an earthquake. And she was ready. Because what no one knew, not her arrogant wife, not her friends who fed on the gossip, not her curious neighbors, was that the gold found in the basement was only the beginning. The real treasure lay in the papers she kept close to her chest, and when the time came, each accusation would become a sign of shame for those who now blamed her. The mansion's ballroom, once a mere party venue, became a social arena. The wife, insatiable in her need to portray herself as a victim, was not content to humiliate the maid in front of those living under the same roof. She needed an audience. She needed witnesses. And so, that afternoon, she gathered her most influential friends, ladies accustomed to measuring status by the weight of their jewels and the amount of secrets they knew about others. They arrived in luxurious cars, parading through the gates like judges already ready with their verdict. At the entrance they were greeted by their wife, who led them to the salon with staged tears, a trembling voice and rehearsed gestures. Her every word was carefully chosen to paint the maid as a threat, a criminal infiltrated under the guise of humility. Sitting in a corner, the young maid listened to the repeated and distorted accusations. They no longer spoke only of theft. Now they added insinuations. They spoke of seduction, manipulation, and ulterior motives. They said she had plans to steal not only the gold, but also the millionaire's heart. The young woman's silence only fueled her wife's fury, who interpreted her calm as insolence. The millionaire, present at the meeting, couldn't hide his discomfort. He watched his wife perform in front of her friends, but every time he glanced at the maid, he noticed something deeper. Her eyes didn't carry the guilt of a thief, but the certainty of someone waiting for the right moment to speak. This silent posture disturbed him, and at the same time awakened a nagging doubt. To add weight to the spectacle, the wife also summoned a family lawyer. He entered the room with an air of importance, but he was nothing more than another puppet willing to please the lady of the house. He said that even without proof, her word carried enough weight to ruin the maid's reputation, that the mere fact of being accused was enough to tarnish her image. Her friends nodded complicitly. However, something unexpected began to happen. Some of the house's employees who had been standing on the sidelines began to observe in silence, gathering discreetly behind the half-open doors. They saw their mistress turn the accusation into a spectacle, and for the first time, felt that perhaps they were facing a greater injustice than they had imagined. The contrast was clear. On one side, the hysterical wife, trying to convince with screams and artificial tears. On the other, the maid, motionless but erect, with steady eyes, conveying a quiet dignity that escaped her mistress's control. That day, the humiliation surpassed the limits of what was acceptable. It was no longer just an accusation within the household, but a social spectacle orchestrated to destroy a life. And yet the young woman remained standing, bearing the weight of the words as if she knew that the truth, when it came out, would bring the whole show crashing down. The rumor that the maid had stolen gold had already escaped the mansion's control. The whispers in the hallways had turned into shouts in the neighborhood streets, and the inevitable happened. A police car pulled up in front of the iron gates. The sound of the doors opening echoed like a muffled thunder that made everyone inside the house hold their breath. 2 police officers entered, not with the rush of an emergency, but with the heavy serenity of those who know they hold authority. The sergeant, a man with a face lined with experience, looked around with suspicious calm. Beside him, a young officer with a firm expression was jotting down every detail like someone collecting pieces of a puzzle. His wife rushed to greet them, theatrical as always, her voice filled with mock indignation. "Gentlemen, thank you for your promptness. This criminal was about to steal everything from us," he said, pointing to the maid as if she were a trophy. The silence that followed was uncomfortable. The maid, erect and motionless, didn't defend herself. She simply clutched to her chest a brown envelope that seemed to carry more weight than any jewel in the house. The sergeant studied her for a long time, as if noticing something out of place in the scene. He asked to see the central object of the accusation. The safe was opened before everyone, revealing the lump of raw gold, still encrusted with dust. The metal reflected the light from the chandelier, but instead of dazzling, it only evoked tension. The sergeant leaned in to examine it. He touched the stone carefully and commented softly, "There's quartz mixed in." "This isn't a finished piece, it's from a seam." The entire room fell silent. The wife, restless, tried to regain control. "It doesn't matter where it came from. What matters is that it was in her hands." It was then that the maid's voice rose for the first time, firm, calm, but filled with something no one expected. "It was in the basement, where it always was. Not in my hands. And you know it." The sergeant looked up, struck by her clarity. His wife nearly exploded in fury. "Lies! She's a thief, she's a liar, she's—" But his voice was cut off by the firm slamming of the agent's clipboard on the table. "We need facts, not theatre," the police officer said, staring at her coldly. "Who else touched the gold before it was sealed?" The silence was deathly. The wife lowered her eyes for a moment, but soon regained her composure, feigning dignity. Still, everyone had noticed. She had been the one who had manipulated the piece first. The millionaire, until then silent, ran his hand over his face and sighed. His eyes met the maid's, and for the first time, something resembling respect flickered in his gaze. There was no longer just doubt. There was also recognition. The documents in the manila envelope remained sealed, guarding the secret that had not yet been revealed. But the mere fact that the police had questioned the wife's version of events had already shattered the empire of accusations she had tried to build. The tables were turning, and the room knew it. The public humiliation had reached its peak, but ironically, it was at this very peak that the first cracks in the truth opened up. Even after the police left, the mansion didn't return to normal. On the contrary, the presence of the law only fueled the fire of public opinion. What was supposed to be an investigation became a social spectacle. Neighbors whispered among themselves, message boards filled with distorted versions, and the word thief began to circulate as a sentence, even without a trial. It was the invisible court, the one that condemns first and only later, if ever, seeks evidence. The wife, clever at manipulating, took advantage of every opportunity to reinforce her story. She wrote enigmatic phrases on her social media. "Sometimes the enemy dresses in the clothes of trust." That was enough to generate a wave of comments, speculation, and shares. She didn't need to name names. Everyone knew who she was referring to. It was a silent massacre, and the maid's reputation became an easy target. Inside the mansion, the atmosphere was stifling. Some servants, fearing reprisals, began to treat her coldly, averting their gaze as if proximity were dangerous. Others, secretly, watched her with respect, recognizing the strength she demonstrated. Because even accused, even stained by public shame, she carried on with dignity. She cleaned the hallways, set the table, served dinner, all with the same calm, as if every gesture were a sign of resistance. But there was one detail impossible to ignore: the brown envelope he never let go of. Tucked against his chest or hidden under the bedroom pillow, that package had become a symbol of mystery. The servants whispered, "What could be inside?" His wife noticed it too, and with each glance at the envelope, her fury grew. It was as if she sensed it held the key that could unravel his charade. One sleepless night, the millionaire couldn't resist. He knocked discreetly on the maid's bedroom door. He found her sitting at the small table, the envelope before her. His eyes were tired but full of curiosity. "Who are you really?" he asked, his voice low, almost a whisper. She didn't answer immediately. She simply opened the envelope and showed him the old photograph. A strong-faced man with calloused hands, standing next to a blonde girl in front of blocks of stone and samples of raw gold. On the back, a phrase written in faded ink: for my heir who will know how to recognize true brilliance." The millionaire shuddered. He recognized the name in the notes, memories of old contracts and stories his father had always avoided discussing. His wife, suddenly appearing in the hallway, caught the scene. Her eyes burned with fury. "I knew it," she screamed. "First the gold, now you're trying to seduce my husband with false stories." The maid calmly closed the envelope and stood. Her look wasn't one of anger, but of someone who knew more than she was letting on. The millionaire, torn between his wife's fury and the silent revelation before him, simply remained silent. At that moment, the war was no longer about a lump of gold, but about something much greater: identity, inheritance, and truth. The public humiliation continued to erode her image, but the flame of revelation had already begun to burn brightly. And soon, everyone in that house would discover who the woman they called their maid really was. Dawn brought with it a different weight. The sun streamed through the mansion's stained glass windows, but instead of illuminating, it seemed to expose the cracks in a house built on lies. The silence at breakfast was dense, broken only by the nervous clink of his wife's spoon against the porcelain cup. The millionaire read the newspaper but couldn't concentrate. His eyes kept searching for the maid, who walked with the same unsettling serenity, clutching the brown envelope to her body as if it were a part of her. His wife could no longer bear his presence. Her every gesture seemed an affront, every silence a scream echoing in her mind. She needed to destroy her once and for all. To do so, she once again summoned her friends, the lawyer, and some influential neighbors, transforming the main hall into a social tribunal. In front of everyone, she branded the maid a fraud, claiming she had fabricated documents to appropriate a fortune that did not belong to her. But it was there, before that scandal-hungry audience, that the young woman finally raised her voice. She didn't shout. She didn't despair. She spoke softly, firmly, and each word seemed to weigh tons in the air. "You accuse me of theft. But the truth is, this gold never belonged to this family. It was always mine." A shock rippled through the room. Nervous laughter echoed among the wife's friends. The lawyer cleared his throat, trying to hide his discomfort. His wife burst into venomous laughter. "Your gold?" he mocked. "Who do you think you are?" The answer came not in words, but in evidence. The maid opened the envelope and removed the documents yellowed with age, with notary stamps and notarized signatures. She placed them on the marble table in front of everyone. The grey-haired executor, present once again, confirmed their authenticity in a firm voice. They were records from decades ago, securing mineral exploration rights for the young woman's father, who had worked in the same region. The millionaire, upon reading the names, felt his heart race. He recognized his own father's signature on one of the papers, confirming a long-standing partnership with the man he now discovered was the maid's father. His expression changed. There was no longer just doubt, but the painful certainty that the story was true. The desperate wife tried to snatch the documents from the young woman's hands, but tripped on the carpet and fell to her knees, as had happened before. This time, however, he didn't get up easily. The symbol was clear. The mistress he had always humiliated was now on the floor, while the maid, previously invisible, stood tall as the rightful heir. The employees, watching the scene from the half-open doors, murmured in shock. Some knelt discreetly, not in submission, but in respect. The atmosphere had changed. The accusation no longer held any weight. The truth was there, written on paper that no one could deny. And yet, the young woman didn't smile. There was no triumph on her face, only the serenity of someone who knew that justice sometimes takes time, but it arrives. The gold gleamed in the safe in the background, but now it was just a detail. The true brilliance lay in the revelation. This maid was no ordinary person. She was the forgotten owner of a story buried by time and greed. The revelation fell upon his wife like a sentence she refused to accept. With each page turned, with each stamp recognized, she felt its power slipping away like sand through her fingers. But a woman accustomed to living by appearances does not give in easily. If the truth threatened to come to light, she would make scandal her last weapon. Still sprawled on the Persian rug, she struggled to her feet, her eyes blazing with fury. "This is a farce," she shouted, her voice thick with despair. Do you really believe this woman has any right to anything in this house? She's nothing more than a servant with delusions of grandeur." But her words rang hollow. The millionaire remained silent, clutching the documents, while the executor confirmed the legitimacy of every detail. His wife's friends, who had previously laughed mockingly, now glanced at each other, uncomfortable. There was no longer any applause for his performance. It was then that the wife decided to attack in a different way. She called a well-known journalist, asking her to come to the mansion to document the farce. Within an hour, photographers were at the gates, and curious neighbors were gathering. What should have been a family secret was becoming a public spectacle. The maid's name, previously whispered, was now thrown into hasty headlines. "Intrigue at the mansion. Maid claims fortune." The pressure was mounting. Inside the house, the wife paraded among the guests, trying to sow doubt. "Don't you see," she said. "She planned it all. She used charm, played the victim, and now she's making up stories to take possession of what isn't hers." But even as he shouted, the waitress remained standing, illuminated by the chandelier's beam. He didn't respond to her provocations. He held the diary and documents tightly, his serene gaze contrasting with his employer's desperation. This contrast alone was devastating. Her every silence was more powerful than any accusation. The millionaire, pressured from all sides, finally stood up. He approached his wife and said gravely, "I recognize that signature. I know my father was part of it. It's not a fabrication." The sentence was a mortal blow. His wife staggered but held on to her last card, emotional manipulation. She turned to him with forced tears. "Are you going to believe her and destroy our family? Are you going to throw away everything we've built? This woman will destroy you." But this time, the tears had no effect. The room was against her, and even the previously submissive employees now regarded the young woman who bore the truth with respect. At the back of the room, the safe remained open, the gold glinting in symbolic detail. But everyone knew that this metal was no longer the center of the dispute. The real battle was between two women, one who had always lived on appearances and power, and another who silently carried the legitimacy of a buried past. And that night, the wife realized she could no longer silence the truth with shouts, nor erase it with gossip. The confrontation was open, and she was about to lose more than the gold. She would lose the throne she had believed to be eternal. The hall remained plunged into a heavy silence, as if the walls had witnessed more than they could bear. The wife, panting, was still trying to recover from the fall that had exposed her before everyone. Her pride was shattered, but she clung to the last shred of arrogance she had left, the hateful gaze fixed on the young maid. The waitress, however, didn't need to respond with fury. She clutched her diary and documents tightly, illuminated by the golden beam of the crystal chandelier. Her face was serene, but her eyes burned with the certainty of someone who finally had justice on their side. She was the living image of a silent victory, not of those who win by shouting, but of those who resist until the truth speaks for itself. The millionaire, faced with the scene, rose slowly. He approached the still open safe, where the gold gleamed in symbolic detail. He ran his hand over the cold metal, as if searching for an answer, and then turned his gaze to his wife and the maid. His voice was deep, firm, and laden with a weight that sealed fates. "That gold was never ours. It always belonged to her." The words echoed through the room, demolishing any remaining arguments her wife had. She staggered, trying to protest, but her voice died in the air. I knew deep down there was no escape. The humiliation she had always heaped on others was now turning on her with renewed force. Karma came slowly, but with cruel punctuality. The employees, gathered discreetly behind the doors, murmured in respect. Some, moved, wiped away tears. For the first time they saw their mistress on the ground and their maid standing, lifted not by luxury or power, but by truth. It was a symbolic inversion, a world turned upside down in a matter of minutes. The wife, lying on the carpet, raised her teary eyes and whispered through her teeth, "This won't stay like this." But her threat sounded weak, powerless, and lacking credibility. She was no longer the absolute mistress of the mansion. She was merely a woman defeated by her own venom. The maid didn't answer. She simply closed the diary and clutched the documents to her chest, as if guarding not just papers, but a lifetime's inheritance. There was no smile on her face, no euphoria. There was only the calm of someone who knows that fate, however cruel, always returns what is rightfully hers. Outside, the wind blew through the trees, bringing with it the whisper of night. The gold gleamed in the vault, but everyone there knew its value no longer lay in the metal. The true treasure was the revealed truth, the symbolic weight of seeing arrogance kneel before dignity. And so, the mansion that had always been the scene of parties and humiliation became that night a scene of silent justice. The wife had fallen to her knees, and the maid, previously invisible, had shown the world who the true owner was. And if you thought this story ended here, get ready. Because in the next video I'll show you an even more shocking revelation, where secrets buried for years come to light in a way no one could have imagined. Don't miss it, because what's to come will shake you even more.